Hey there, I'm DPadGamer and welcome to another book review. In this one we're talking about the final book in the Silo Trilogy, that being Dust by Hugh Howey. I just woke up having finished it last night and man, that was a good book. I will say, it wasn't perfectly paced. It did have some parts that felt a little iffy. Right out the gate, I will say before getting spoilers, it's like an 8 out of 10. Altogether, the trilogy is really good. I really enjoyed it. But, okay, spoilers. So, the second book was exactly as I thought. It was a lot of lead up, there's a lot of backstory. The third one takes place a couple weeks after the first one ended, in which Julia is now the leader of the silo. She is having them dig down in between silo 18 and 17 as I expected. Which ends up saving them later on when Thurman turns out he was actually never dead. Donald tried to kill him, but Thurman totally lived and basically took Donald into imprisonment and sort of destroyed Silo 18. So it was like 2 books worth of lead up into this moment where you go, oh God, this is happening. Like, I actually felt panic in my body as I realized that this story, like all these characters that we'd come to know, they were all about to die. And they had to rush out of their silo as they got to experience the silo's collapse in real time. Something we had heard about, we'd seen through proxy, but never firsthand. And Hugh Howey does an excellent job of portraying this panic moment where people are screaming over the radio, freaking out, like Peter Billings, the sheriff we've come to know and love, dies by seeing that the airlock outside is opened up on its own and he can see through the outside, and it's scary and it's so well done. I don't like the parts with Charlotte, which is Donald's sister. I feel like she doesn't feel like a real fleshed out character, but she has some parts that I can not relate to necessarily, but I can feel sympathetic to her plight, because she is stuck in this really horrible situation where she's the only woman in Silo 1. She's basically a fugitive, and she's trying to not die, not get caught, and trying to do something. And she ends up living, which is great. Silo 18, most of them die. Silo 17, they're gonna die, but they managed to come up with a plan. The plan itself was really dumb. Like the idea that there was these diggers just outside of the silos, like in caverns, all pointed at a certain escape point, was really ham-fisted, and I felt like it was just sort of contrived. When I went on the Wikipedia page for this book, or this series, and I learned that this series was actually not 3 books necessarily, but a collection, like I think 8 short stories. So it started with a short story for Wool, which was then expanded. So each of those sections in the first book were actually short stories. So when you think of it like that, and you look at the grand scheme of things, it makes sense. And I could see why the story progressed like this, and why there was a little bit of parts of these stories were a bit shaky in terms of their overall plot movement / flow. But I liked it. I really like the world. I do think that some of it was underwhelming. Like the very end sequence felt a little like they just went for it, and there was no hardship on their way out of the silo. Obviously they had a lot of hardship up to that point, but once they decide to leave the silo, all 200 or whatever of them left, there's no problem. They just walk out of the essentially nano dust cloud totally fine. I was right though. Sorry, in my understanding of oh my god. I just woke up and I'm having coffee and my body's like, no, I'm not ready to talk. But I was right in my understanding that it was basically a large cloud surrounding their silo. And it's interesting because at a certain point they realized by taking samples that the silos themselves were putting off the nanos, which doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of what we learned from Thurman. It's weird, but at the very end of it, you got Charlotte, you got Juliet. Our main boy Luke died. That's really sad. But we got some other main characters. I love that Solo, aka Jimmy Parker, had a huge part in like this whole thing. There was a part where he took up the mantle of protecting one of the little girls, Elise, and he come up upon this church where this fanatical group of churchgoers or whatever. One of them was marrying Elise, this 7-year-old girl, because he was crazy and thought the world was gonna end. It was dumb. But the point is, Solo, aka Jimmy, walks in with a black rifle, and he's like, "Wow, you guys do marriages really fast. Do you do funerals just as fast?" And then shot the dude. And it was so cheesy, but I loved it. I love seeing this character that at first felt like a wild, crazy person just stuck in Silo 17, but turns out he's an odd fellow because of all of his time alone, but he's actually a really good dude, really, really smart, actually, really knowledgeable. And when it finally comes time for them to all be outside, he starts taking up the mantle of like hunting for them with his rifle, and actually ends up being a Juliet says that when it comes time for another recount, he's a shoo-in for the next mayor, which I think is fantastic. I love seeing that progression of that character. Juliet, I feel like she doesn't change as much. If anything, she becomes more broken as the series goes on, which is unfortunate, but definitely understandable. Donald, he had an interesting arc when I think about it. He went from a congressman to being stuck inside of the silo to being a worker in the silo, and then realizing who he was, and then being the leader of the silo, and then being a rebel trying to take down the silo, and eventually a suicide bomber who took down the silo. And then when you think about it all like this, like, dear God, that was a lot of stuff to go through for one man. Like, over the course of, for him, it was like 2 or 3 years. His life changed so much death and destruction, and it's crazy. It was interesting. Not every character had a satisfying progression. I feel like Lucas never really went anywhere. He was always stuck in Juliet's shadow, I think, because he was always just like, he was at first like the guy that didn't know what was going on, and then became the head of IT after shadowing Bernard. He learned some stuff, which was cool, but when you get down to the end of it, he basically just died like it was nothing. And it was, the way he died was very sad, and I think did also lead into certain revelations with the way they pumped the gas out to destroy Silo and what that meant for the characters. But all in all, it felt, I guess it was just disappointing. It was sort of like in Game of Thrones, spoilers in Game of Thrones, but the titular character in that, or not titular, but a main character in that one dies in the first season, and you go, oh God, all of that, and it ended with that. But like in the grand scheme of thing, it makes sense, and there's a reason to it, and it has lasting repercussions. It's sort of like that, but the fact of the matter is, it happens in the second, the 2/3 of the way through the last book. So the sort of repercussions, the sort of lasting implications of Luke's death really don't pan out. So you're left with this experience where it's like, oh, it's just sad. I just wish he was still around. But yeah, there was a lot of things that were left unexplored. Like, we still have no idea what happened to Silo 40. It's explained a little bit that essentially Silo 40 went rogue. They disabled their blasting charges, the gas lines, the camera feeds, so that Silo 1 had no control over them. But you have no idea where they went. You don't know if they're somehow made it out. The whole silo setup makes no sense, really. The fact that these 50 silos all had, I guess, ways to get out at any point, but just didn't know. I almost expected for them to finally get out of there and realize that there was already a silo that had escaped, which definitely would have ruined the moment, I think, which is probably why that didn't happen. But it would have made a lot of sense if Silo 40 had broken free like 100 years earlier, and basically had an encampment going. I think it would have been great, but it's unfortunate, but it's a great world. I really enjoyed the idea they got going on, the fact that through this whole thing, after 300 years of undergroundness, what comes out are still humans, but definitely like their culture is different, their knowledge is different, and it's interesting seeing like Elise, this small little 7-year-old girl with her memory book full of information from the almanacs of like old world knowledge. So she knows what deers are, she knows what the stars are like, and talking to these silo goers, it's such an interesting disconnect between the two types of characters. So I think that lends itself well to some interesting shifts in expectations. I feel like if there were a continuation of the story once they're above ground, there wouldn't be much in terms of progression they could go for, except like making an encampment, making a city, and seeing what comes from it. It almost makes me think of a series called The 100, which my mom just loves. But I watched the first, I think, season or so. The idea is a 100 kids get blasted down from their spacefaring space station life and end up on Earth, and Earth is actually totally fine. So it's like the idea of leaving the silo and going above ground, and it's fine at a certain point. And they basically form a small town, and then it basically gets to the point where they're like fighting with other factions, and it's really dumb. And I feel like if the Silo Trilogy were to progress into the Above Ground Trilogy, it would probably get to that point where it's just really convoluted, and you're creating more factions just to have more conflict, just for more story. And it really is the point where it's like, good stories have to have an ending. I get that. I do wish there was like more to this, because it feels like the book 2 was so like I'm just like over here like hoping there's more somehow. Maybe there could be another story or short stories around Silo 40. I know there was a comic adapted from this trilogy in some way, shape, or form, and there's like a TV show being made for AMC about the trilogy. I think those could be really great. I haven't looked into the comic book, but in general, I like this story. I definitely won't forget it. I feel like it lends itself well to a lot of creative thinking. Like, apparently people out there have made fan fictions of like other silos or other stories in this universe, and I could definitely see it lending itself well to that. In general, I really enjoyed it. I'll probably check out more stuff by Hugh Howey, because I know he has other books, but I like his writing. There are parts where it's not super great, but overall it's pretty good. My cat's meowing at me, so I think I'll end it here. But thanks for watching. That's my review of Dust and and the Silo Trilogy as a whole. Next book I'll be reading is The Devil in the White City, a historical fiction serial murder thing. I don't know. Should be interesting. But yeah, that's it for this one. Ending it off, Dust, I'll give it like an 8 out of 10. The Silo Trilogy as a whole, 8.5 out of 10. Pretty good. Above average. Not perfect, but I really enjoyed it. Great way to start the year. The first book of this year was garbage, but we got 3 nice ones, so I think we're off to a good start. So yeah, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching. See you then.